I'll give this in English. There's an English-speaking audience. First of all, I apologize that I'm not in person due to the health ministry regulations. Anyway, I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. So the title is Dynamic Composition in Conversational Domain Exploration. That's one of the efforts that we're doing in our NLP team in the research group in Israel, and I'm leading that team. I don't have much time to go through all the details of this specific effort, but there is a paper that we've just published. It's going to appear in the coming WWW conference. You can actually find it already online with this title, so you can read more about different details if you're interested. And I'll try to just highlight some elements of this work. So first of all, it's a team effort, and you can see all the participants in Israel, but also collaborations with other teams in Google, in the US and other places in Europe. So it's a pretty big effort that's been spanning for several years now. So what's conversational domain exploration? This is a type of open-ended dialogue in which the user comes to talk to the bot because the bot is knowledgeable in some domain, and the user is interested in learning and enriching his understanding in that domain. When I'm thinking about domain, this could be a very casual kind of domain, such as getting updated on my team's last game or its standings. It could be encyclopedic knowledge, like the animal kingdom, and it also could be debating kind of style of domains like global warming. And the entry point for discussing with our bot, the way we see it, because we are part of Google and the main entry point for dialogues today is Google Assistant, is some casual information-seeking queries such as, who won the last game or how fast are cheetahs. And at this point, we would like to let users who talk to the assistant to start participating in a dialogue and open the dialogue around that specific domain and learning more about that domain, if they're interested. Now, there are three attributes for bots that should handle the domain exploration. First of all, we should understand that this is not a debate, so it's not like one side having a monologue about one opinion, the other side having a monologue about another opinion. And it's also not a summary. So it's not the user being a consumer who sits down and just the bot summarizing all the information in a kind of a Wikipedia page. This is an interactive dialogue in which both the user and the bot explore the domain in an interactive dialogue way. The other thing is the bot has to be grounded in high quality knowledge, because that's why the user comes to talk with that bot. It has information the user doesn't, wants to learn new things. And that also means that a lot of the times users don't even know what to ask. They might know the entry point, like how fast are cheetahs, but maybe they don't know other things about cheetahs. They don't even know what's interesting about cheetahs. And here the bot has to be proactive and both introduce maybe new content the user might be interested in, and also lead the conversation to new areas in the domain. Maybe another team, maybe another animal, things like that. So I want to show you an example of how such a conversation can happen today. So if you go to the Google Assistant today and ask, who won the Warriors game, you get the answer. They won against the Celtics today. And that's it. And you can actually keep on having this kind of Q&A conversation, and Google Assistant is pretty good at answering questions. So if you know what you need, if you know what to ask, then you get good answers and you can continue this conversation. If you do the same thing with our bot, this is the conversation you get. This is a real conversation that real users conducted in the assistant. I changed all the figures, all the names, all the dates, so you won't be able to trace it to a real game or anything, but the original conversation was copied from the logs. And what you can see here is a conversation that starts, who won the game? You get the answer again, they won against the Celtics, but we had some conversation driver. In this case, Curry was the top scorer, trying to see if the user is interested in starting a conversation with us. In this case, the user was, and he asked, tell me more about him. We can understand the focus. We understand we're still talking about Curry in a specific game, provide more information, how many points he scored, he had 10 rebounds, 6 assists. And the user then asks, who do they play next? Again, you have to maintain the focus, understanding we're talking about the Warriors, and can provide the answer. It's going to be against the Philadelphia, maybe an enriching sentence like the 76ers are ranked first, in the Eastern conferences, it's probably going to be an interesting game. And in this conversation, the user actually ended with, how much are tickets. So you can see a nice journey where he started by asking, previous game, and ended by interest in going to a future game, which is really nice. So these are kinds of dialogues that we are aiming for. So we're exploring a little bit of the domain. Maybe the user will be interested in asking more questions about the team, players, and their standings and their performance. But not everything is such green and beautiful. So here's another example. Again, a real conversation changing all the entities in it. What time do the Lakers play on Sunday? They're going to play tomorrow. And the last game between them ended 109-99 to the Cavs. And the user answered with, I don't need to know that. Okay, so in this case, the user wasn't really happy with us giving him more information and trying to get him into a conversation. And there could be many reasons, right? So it could be just a user that's not interested in chatting with a bot. Or maybe it's just not the right time. He's, going to work, and he's not. If he was at home, maybe in the afternoon he had more time. He might be interested in chatting. Or maybe he's a Lakers fan, and we provided a negative information that they lost to the Cavs, and he's not happy with this. So all this kind of details, we are also interested in figuring out when and where is the right time to try and get the users into or when is the user in a conversational mood. May not, and not annoying, trying to get into a conversation when it's not needed. Okay, so how do we create such kinds of conversations? We have a new approach we call dynamic composition, and I'll explain what's it around. So first of all, when we talk about good domain exploration dialogues, the main thing that we notice is that we need great content. And you can think about several layers of content. It could be structured data coming from a knowledge graph, for example, the points the player scored, the standing of a team, the height of an animal. But you also have unstructured text. It could be news snippets around the game, or it could be some facts about that animal from the web. And you can go even further into rich media, videos, images that are related to the conversation. And one is that with all these rich sources of data, we need to have good control of the content that we generate. We want to generate first accurate content, but also one that it's not boring. And we also notice that there's no one single method that works well for all content types. The way you can get content from news and put it into a conversation versus Wikipedia versus knowledge base are very different. And images again, as another example. So if you look at dialogue modeling, open-ended dialogue modeling today, there are two main paradigms. One is retrieval-based, where you might have billions of historic responses in some open-ended conversation. Think about indexing all of WhatsApp or all of Twitter. And in this case, once you have a conversation, hopefully at least one of the stored responses in the index would fit that conversation. This works well because you have content that's being written by humans, so the text and the syntax, everything looks good, but it's not flexible enough to answer some sort, especially if the information is very fresh or users have very specific needs that are not necessarily what other users were asking before. And personalization is another issue that's hard to handle in this case. On the other hand, you have end-to-end generative models, and your models will generate the response word by word. They are very flexible. Any context will get a response, which is appropriate to that response. But they are still struggling with issues such as grounding with real knowledge, being consistent, and not saying, I'm a boy versus I'm a girl, which has just been an example quite often. And of course, not hallucinating things. If you talk about games, with chatbot, you might get weird figures that never appeared in a game. So what we propose is somewhere in the middle, a model that from one side takes full utterances that come from real reputable, if you like, sources, but on the other hand, compose them together. So the model is still flexible enough to generate responses that are tailored to the current context. So the two main elements that we have is one, to separate between content generation, so we can control the content and make sure that it's correct and interesting, and then later on select from all candidates. And then based on that, compose a response. But we can compose a response out of more than one utterance versus just retrieving a single response from an index. So let me show you how it works as a high-level schema. If you start, let's say, with a query, how long do lions live? We have content providers, each one offering a different kind of response to the user's input. So it might be, the answer, lions can live 10 to 14 years wild. It could be a question, why do you ask? Or, insights like, some lions live longer, or maybe a comparison, they live longer than zebras. And then we have a dialog manager that will select one of these utterances and return them. But at this point, the dialog manager will go back to the content providers and say, well, now the context has changed. This is the first utterance. We're going to return the response. Do you want to add something else? And different utterances can now be proposed. And the dialog manager will pick again, loop again in the composition loop and ask for more content. Maybe this time we'll pick another question that has been offered. And at some point, the dialog manager will say, that's good enough for me. That's the response I'm going to return. In a way, these are still kind of a list of utterances, and that's why we have a final element in this model where we take the selected utterances and combine them together, fuse them together into one coherent response. So it could be gentle things like, let's remove the word lions because it's just repeating, and we can make things more compact, and that's actually important. I'll mention it briefly later on. But we can do much more than that. In this talk, I'll talk about a little bit about the first and a little bit about the second aspect here of the providers and the manager, and you can take a look at the paper for sentence fusion. If you want to change to another domain, it's mainly changing the providers. So if you're talking about sports, we'll change, for next matches or historical games. You might have news that's more related to sports than to encyclopedic information. And hopefully the architecture around the dialog manager and sentence fusion will remain the same. Okay, so I want to show you some content providers and how they can be combined together. So here's a response. How much does an elephant weigh? Conversation. African forest elephants can weigh up to 5.9 tons, about half the weight of a school bus. Would you like to hear more cool stuff about them? Yes. So I read on this side that forest elephants are smaller in size, with more rounded ears and thinner tusks, and they can be as much as 12.5 taller than most doors. Now I color-coded the different providers that actually participated in each of these responses. So again, you can see how we can combine and also see the difficulties in combining different sources. So think about knowledge graph information such as the weight of an elephant or its height. So this is structured information, and you can generate a text that's related to that piece of information based on templates or a neural model. Another interesting thing is that we can have providers that offer perspective of a piece of information that was mentioned before. So in this case, elephants can weigh up to 5.9 tons, and you can say something like, about half a weight of a school bus, right? And this shows that providers are very contextualized. They can actually take a look at the history in order to decide what to propose as the next response. We, as part of our design, we have different conversation drivers. So question is one of them, like, would you like to hear more cool stuff about them? But we could also have things like teasers, comparisons, and other kinds of pivoting in order to try and drive the conversation, keep on going, and be proactive in where and what we want to say to the user, where we're going to take it in the journey or in the domain. A difficult type of content that we are still struggling with is unstructured data. So in this case, we have facts that were mined from the web, right? I read on Cornell EDU that, etc. One of the difficult things is not just trying to figure out which one fits best the current context, is also to understand what's written there in order to pick up follow-up responses. Okay, so that's around providers, but doing the selection, that's the dialog manager's responsibility. And as we've seen, the task is to pick up the next utterance, but it's not trivial. So if you look at the example here, when's the next game? The Warriors going to play against the Lakers. That's going to be the first utterance that will return. It's the answer. That's pretty clear. But then, what's going to be the next utterance? It could be, who do you think will win? Or their last game ended just 2 points apart, or beware, the Lakers have won the last 5 games. Any of them will make sense, and as you can see, picking the right thing, what is the right thing in this case, is not a trivial question. And if you think about the dialogue manager, there are 2 levels of planning here. One is to build up a high-quality response, but on the other hand, building a long, engaging conversation. And they are kind of contradictory. So, for example, we might not try to push all the interesting stuff we have in just one response, but split it along the dialogue to make it maybe easier for the user to consume things, but also make it more eager to continue the dialogue. I will not talk about the architecture. It's a neural network, hierarchical RNN model. You can take a look at the paper and see it. I think that it's more interesting to talk about the data that we're using to train that neural model. So what we do today is we have raters that converse with our bot and make conversations. So here's an example. The rater will start with the Warriors next game, and you get a response. They will next host the Timberwolves, who do you think will win? And then the Warriors, obviously, and another response. But once the dialogue ends, what we do in the background is we record the whole conversation. And the conversation is made, for example, with the assistant to have a similar feeling of how it will look for real users. We also ask for raters to have a kind of persona. Think about you as a fan of the Warriors and then talk about it or something like that. So we have this kind of, user input and the bot's response. And if you go, once we record a conversation, we go to our own rating tool. And there, the raters can go over their inputs and the responses and rate them. But the way they rate them, if you remember, like the single bot response is composed from several utterances, like they will next host Timberwolves, and then who do you think will win? And for each one, we ask them to rate. So it's not rating the whole response, not even the whole dialogue, but actually deep diving to every utterance that's been selected and rate whether it was appropriate or not, that's interesting or not. So in this case, the rater might say, yes, it's pretty good. But in this case, we actually also show all the other candidates from all other kinds of providers that were there at the time where the dialogue manager had to select the utterance. And when we asked the raters to rate them as well, which means that, maybe we'll pick up one utterance that's not very good, but maybe there were others that are good. And in this process, we can get ratings for other candidates as well. And doing so, we can get for around one conversation, let's say around 2 turns or something like that, we can get up to 100 training examples. So you can easily get to 100,000 training examples with just 1,000 conversations that are raters. But there are limitations with this approach. First of all, the scale. We still have several dozen raters that we have to train, and it will take time for them to create a lot of conversations. There's biasing with few raters. And also in terms of coverage, it just cannot cover all the aspects that are possible to converse with a bot. Raters are, of course, cooperative. If they get to a bad place in the conversation, they will just continue talking. Eventually, maybe the bot will recover, maybe not. But real users don't do that. If they get to something really bad, they'll just curse you and go away. And finally, there's no real context. Like the user need is not really clear. So we tell the raters something like, try to think of yourself as a fan, but that's not a real user with the right context. So I do want to mention other options of data collection paradigms that we are looking at. So rater to bot is the one that I mentioned. There's human to human. You can actually have 2 humans converse and create dialogues. The issue here is that these conversations usually differ from the bot capabilities that we're building, and it's not clear how this kind of transfer learning can be applied in these cases. There's user to bot. Those are real users talking to the bot. This is great, but first it requires a working bot. So there's a bootstrapping step here. And also there are privacy issues. right? So it's not clear how can we record or collect real user conversations and use them to train a model with all legal and privacy issues. So that's another issue that kind of blocks this direction. And the other one is human to operator with a Wizard of Oz kind of case where two humans converse, but one of them is actually getting examples from the bot, looking at different utterances and play the role of the dialogue manager and builds up responses from the different candidates. This comes much closer to the capabilities of the bot, but it's still complex and slow and comes with similar issues with the raters that we have. Okay, so with the last few minutes that I have, I want to talk about an experiment that we did around the NBA domain with this bot. So we integrated our bot in Google Assistant to try and answer NBA dialogues, start conversing around NBA in entry points like, teams, last game, next game, schedule, things like that. And first we had human evaluators, others than the one we rated, to conduct conversations with the assistant around NBA. They were asked to have at least 3 conversation turns, like 3 user inputs, and rate the conversations, and they were randomly given the vanilla Google Assistant or the one with our bot integrated. And as you can see, we've seen a nice improvement with our bot when they were scaling between 1 to 5. But again, this is just a small set of users that are very cooperative and other types of different attributes than real users. So we then decided to go to a live experiment, an A/B testing experiment, where we were given to some percentage of the Google Assistant users chance of. They were not actually aware of that, but they were served with the version of Assistant with our bot. This was live for the whole last NBA season for 6 months. And I can show you the results that we have. It's again a multi-turn experience. If the user starts with something like team's last game, then our bot will take over the conversation and we'll have a conversation with the user until the user yields, gives up, stops, or anything else. And again, it looks like just the regular Google Assistant in terms of responses. So what do we have in terms of metrics? So first of all, what we've seen is that users provided more or daily NBA queries when talking to our version of the bot, which is nice, meaning that they liked what they see and came back for more. We also saw longer conversations. Usually the conversations are not very long, so around 3 user inputs on average or something like that. But we could see conversations that are maybe 20 user inputs length sometimes, or even more. But on average, we've seen when we look at follow-ups, NBA follow-ups, queries that follow another NBA query in very small time, so around, I think, less than a minute, there was an increase of around 4%. But we also saw a nice increase when users try to, after they have some NBA queries, follow up to another sports field. So there's an increase of around 3% going that direction. We've also saw an increase in gratitude, such as thank you, but also with stops, shut-ups, and other types of really bad-mouthing us. The last 2 are actually significantly limited, or I think it's more than 2 scales, something like that, smaller in terms of volume. But still, they're interesting to understand how users react to that. They also mainly appear on voice devices. So we actually launched with both on Pixel, with the UI, and also on voice only with Google Home. And these, the thank yous and stops, came mainly on Google Home. We actually started with a much higher stops rate and managed to get it lower. Of course, bugs were one issue, but others, for example, was sentence fusion. And the more we managed to compress our long responses and compact them and make them sound more natural, users like them more, and we're happy with them more. So I just want to conclude. So what other things we're still looking at? So first of all, we're still trying to figure out what's the right evaluation paradigm for such types of dialogues, domain exploration. As I mentioned before, incorporating unstructured data is not trivial, and we're still looking in different directions in the head there. Currently, our users are very asymmetric in terms of data. So they navigate in the domain together with the bot, but they're not providing a lot of their own knowledge as part of the conversation. And we're thinking, how can this be changed? As I said, training from users, that's great, but we would like to see also how can we infer implicit signals in order to actually train from that. That's another thing. And finally, as I mentioned in the beginning, not all users want to start a conversation with us. We have to understand when and where is the right place to try and have that kind of conversations. And that's it. Thank you. I don't know if